A few weeks ago, when Noelia very kindly wrote to me to invite me to this event, she mentioned a paper of mine that I published a few years back on the topic of counterfactuals in science. And I thought, well, that would have been a great paper to discuss for this workshop. Except I have this principle where I try really hard not to present published work. I only try to present work in progress in talks, and so I didn't really want to go back and represent an old view. But it got me thinking, and I realized that over the last 4 or 5 years, my own view had changed quite substantially. So I thought, hey, you know what? Maybe it's time to revisit this and see if I can improve and how my view has changed. And that's exactly what I'm planning to do here today. That should explain the take two part of my title here. And the first part of my title is the counterfactuals as placeholder is my, oops, let me see if I can, there we go. It's my blast from the past. And what I mean by that, I'm just referring to the paper I just mentioned. It's a paper that came out as part of a volume that was also co-edited a few years back. The volume was focused on the philosophy of molecular medicine. And so I kind of tried to give my view of counterfactual reasoning in molecular medicine. But the truth is, and it was clear to me also back then, the view was not confined to medicine. Again, I focused on medicine because of the general topic of the volume, but I thought that what I had to say about counterfactual reasoning in medicine would apply more broadly to counterfactual reasoning in science per se. And specifically, I thought that counterfactual played a very important role, again, in medical decision-making, but even more broadly throughout science. And so I gave a few examples, and here Ruth's talk comes in very handy because I can just hand wave and gesture to a lot of the great points that she's made much better than I ever could. But just to give you a flavor, a couple of examples, my thought was when we reason scientifically or even in mundane settings, we play out in our heads a number of scenarios that actually run counter to the facts. Here's a couple of examples. Think about a diagnosis. A diagnosis of what happens when you and I go to see the doctor and the physician says, hey, given these symptoms you're exhibiting, to the best of my knowledge, you might be suffering from a certain condition and so forth. So what kind of inference is that? Many people think it's an explanation. To me, it seemed like it's not an explanation because it doesn't quite give you the full story or really any story at all. What it does, it's kind of select what best explanation fits the data, and that's what in philosophy of science we tend to call abduction or inference of the best explanation. And diagnosis, like counterfactuals, is backward facing. The converse, if you will, is a prognosis, which again is what happens when the physician says, well, I expect the disease to run its course as follows. This may happen, this could happen, that should happen, and so forth. And I think this is, in a sense, the specular kind of inference where we're not dealing with explanation, or it's future facing, we're dealing with prediction. But again, a prognosis is not really a full prediction. It's just what, and again, for lack of a better term, I like to call an inference to the best prediction. But the crucial point is that both endeavors are fundamentally comparative. They require us to think through a number of possible scenarios that many of which run counter to the facts. Most of these possible explanations are not actual explanation. Most of these possible predictions are never borne out or will never be borne out. And in this respect, I thought, well, they're a great example of counterfactual reasoning. And so that, of course, led me to the follow-up question. What are these counterfactual statements such that they play such a crucial role within science itself? And of course, this is not, it's hardly a new question within philosophy. It goes back all the way to the work of Nelson Goodman in the 1950s. Of course, Lewis and Stallnacker that were mentioned in the 1970s and so forth. But a point that, to the best of my knowledge, has not been stressed often enough is that if philosophy has focused very extensively on these wacky statements, I don't think that really applies to philosophy of science. I mean, philosophers of science, we've been mostly happy and swift to delegate discussion on counterfactual to our colleagues who work in metaphysics, the philosophy of language, linguistics, and so forth. And this obviously has an effect, because I don't think it's surprising that most of the work on statements in general, counterfactual being no exceptions, focus on semantics and pragmatics. The truth value, what makes these statements true or false, and conversely, how the context of the feature of utterance affect the truth value. There's nothing wrong with this. You know, we touched upon a lot of very interesting and controversial and intriguing features. However, I think it's not that useful if our ultimate goal is to explain what the ultimate goal of counterfactual is within scientific inquiry, broadly construed. And the reason is that semantics and pragmatics only have a very partial role within scientific inquiry. Why is that? Well, there's an old adage in the philosophy of science, which I've learned from one of my philosophical heroes, Nancy Cartwright, who over 40 years ago now wrote a paper saying the truth doesn't explain much. And I think that 40 years later, that point is still holds. The truth still doesn't explain much. And there's a long story to be told about the limitations of verocentrism in the philosophy of science. Incidentally, if anyone here is looking for a great topic for a PhD thesis, I think that would be it. I'm not going to focus on this here today, because in the case of counterfactuals, I can take a shortcut. The idea that the truth of a counterfactual is of very limited service to understanding why we utter this, what we would call the epistemic status of these counterfactuals is an old point. It's an old objection that goes back to the seminal work of Saul Kripke, specifically his Humphrey's objections that he raised in the seminal Naming and Necessity. So I think this is all to say that there's nothing wrong with focusing on the truth of counterfactuals, on their semantics, pragmatics, and so forth. But I don't think that holds much hope of explaining what their scientific role is, the role they play within scientific inferences. And so I thought, well, maybe there's some work to be done here, and so I tried to give it a fair shot here. And the outcome of my thinking about this is a thesis I call the Counterfactuals as Placeholders. Let me just give you a very succinct statement with a toy example. More realism will come as we move along. Take a very simple counterfactual statement. Had the match been struck, it would have lit. Old, simple, trite, but hopefully will illustrate my point. Now, clearly, when I say had the match been struck, it would have lit, I'm not talking about what happens to us, the match in a possible world, in a potential scenario. I'm talking about the specific match I'm holding in my hand, and I'm ascribing it some kind of modal property. I'm ascribing to it something like flammability or something like that. None of this is surely not novel. My hope is not even that controversial. The piece that I tried to add, which was much more controversial and hopefully interesting, was that it seemed to me that when I say that the match in question is flammable, I'm doing absolutely nothing to explain why the match is flammable. There's no explanation there. And so this raises a puzzle. Like, wait, if you're saying something that has no explanatory value, what exactly does this contribute to the statement? And note, flammability is a disposition. I can give a counterfactual analysis. So instead of saying had the match been struck, it would have lit, I could say the match is flammable. These are, as I'll explain over the next few minutes, are two sides of the same coin. But what exactly am I adding to the conversation? Not an explanation, it seemed to me. It seemed to me that this point to the existence of an explanation. What I'm saying is, hey, there's an explanation there to be given. I'm not giving it to you, but it's there, and it's if I wanted to, or if someone smarter than myself wanted to, they could give you the explanation of what's going on. And this basically is what the idea that the counterfactual stands in for an explanation. The counterfactual is a placeholder. And so here's how I put it back then. And I'm not putting up my quote to toot my own horn. I'm sharing with you because I now think this is problematic, but I'll get to this in a minute. So here's how I put the point back in 2016. I said, counterfactual conditionals are placeholders that stand in for predictions and explanations that a speaker commits to producing in principle, regardless of whether she or anyone else is capable of producing them in practice. To emphasize placeholders, counterfactuals themselves do not provide the explanation or justify the prediction. They simply commit the speaker to the existence of some explanation or justification that gets the job done. So this is what was my thought. This is what counterfactuals end up doing. Okay, I'm done with my blast from the past. Now let me move back to the present here. I developed that thesis was from 2016, and a year before, in a different paper, I made a similar point about dispositions. Both counterfactual and dispositions, on my view, are placeholders in the sense that I just explained. Now, you might start thinking, okay, this guy, everything he sees, it looks like a placeholder, and that might actually be true. Maybe that's the case, but in the specific situation with counterfactual and placeholders, it shouldn't be surprising, because if you're like myself and you buy into a conditional analysis of disposition, a counterfactual analysis of dispositions, it should not be surprising that these two philosophical constructs go hand in hand, because they're two sides of the same coin. Talking about conditionals, subjunctive conditionals, talking about dispositions is pretty much the same thing, at least on the analysis I favor and defend. Okay, but then I've claimed that both are placeholders, and 4 to 5 years later, this still strikes me as correct. I think there's something fundamentally right about that intuition. I'm happy to hold my own ground. However, and this is the reason why I share that quote with you, I also claimed that as placeholders, neither the counterfactual nor the associated disposition provide any explanation. And now these strikes me as problematic. And so what I thought I would do today is share with you why I think there's a problem here, and offer a possible sketch of a solution. So this is my plan for today. Treasure quest. And so if you don't mind a shameless piece of self-promotion, but also an explanation of what's going on, the reason why I changed my view is that since that paper was published for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working pretty frantically on a book project, a much bigger project. And finally, the book is seeing the light. I'm actually sharing for the very first time a preview of the cover. The book should be out in a couple of months. And all of this is to say it's part of a bigger project, a bigger story. There's a whole chapter on the book is called Black Boxes, How Science Turns Ignorance into Knowledge. And there's a whole chapter on counterfactuals and the distinctions that I'm going to draw, that I'm going to mention today, pretty much come out of that bigger project. All this is to say, if you feel free to press me more, I'm going to try to keep this nice and short, but I have a lot more to add and to say if you'd like me to. All right, so why do I think I was wrong a few years back? To make the point, let me borrow an influential example that's not mine. It goes back to Elliot Sober. And Sober says, consider, and I'll give you the reference on the next slide. Sober says, consider a population of fruit flies. And these fruit flies come in 2 types. He calls them A types and B types. And this can be something as simple as straightforward, having red eyes versus having white eyes or something like that. And at some point in time, right now, I check, and the roughly half of the population are A type, they have red eyes, and the other half has white eyes, they're B type. And then I come back after 6 months, and I see that the ratio has changed. All of a sudden, we have 80% of the flies are type A, and only 20% are type B. So how do we explain this kind of change in frequency? And Sober says, well, here's a simple explanation. Type A flies must be fitter than type B flies. But of course, we should all realize that that's not the end of the story. If we want to know more, what's going on here with the flies, what we can do is look further, delve deeper into what's going on. And to go with Sober's example, we might discover, for instance, that A-type flies are associated with a thicker thorax, which increases the insulation, providing better protection for the flies in the winter months, yada, yada, yada. The point is now we have a different explanation, a deeper explanation, a more detailed explanation that dispenses completely with the initial appeal to fitness. And so the question is, what's the relationship between these two levels? We have a shallower explanation and we have a deeper explanation. How are they related? And this is what Sober says. And let me just give you again the quote, and then I'll discuss in some detail. Sober, and again, the example and the quote come from his philosophy of biology textbook. Sober says, once a detailed physical characterization is obtained, we no longer need to use the word fitness to explain why the traits change frequency. The fitness concept provided our initial explanation, but the physical details provide a deeper one. This does not mean that the first account was entirely unexplanatory. Fitness is not the empty idea of a dormant virtue. The point is that although fitness is explanatory, it seems to be a placeholder for a deeper account that dispenses with the concept of fitness. And of course, you can imagine once I read the word placeholder here, I started getting intrigued. So what's going on here? Let me clarify a little bit the general idea. First and foremost, Sober notes that fitness supervenes on its underlying physical basis, which it's just a fancy philosophical way of saying that fitness is determined by the underlying biological, biochemical, physical properties of the organism in question. How fit you are depends on your biological constitution. Nothing controversial here, I think. But at the same time, let me note that fitness is also a dispositional property, a propensity to survive and reproduce. Again, this is not my insight. This is a very it's a view that was developed in the philosophy of biology by Susan Mills and John Beatty in the late 1970s. It's, to the best of my knowledge, a very popular way of defining fitness. It's not completely uncontroversial. There's some people who think that fitness should not be defined as a disposition. If you're among those people, I'll ask you to hold on tight, because this is just an illustration. Once I'm able to make my general point, if you don't think it applies to fitness, you can just pick a different example. We can pick a different example. Nothing hinges on my choice of fitness per se. So again, if you think this is a misguided definition, no, I'll ask you to suspend judgment for just a few minutes. Okay, so if fitness is a disposition, and as I mentioned earlier, disposition and conditionals are two sides of the same coin, then both the disposition and the conditional, per Sober's view, are placeholders for a deeper analysis. And I like that very much. The question now is, great, are placeholders explanatory? And if you remember from the earlier quote, back then I said no, the placeholder doesn't explain a thing. It's a placeholder for an explanation, but the placeholder in question doesn't explain. Now, Sober, in contrast, argues in the positive. He says, actually, fitness does explain. And that got me thinking, maybe he's right about that. But then he also says something more. He says, fitness is not a virtus dormitiva, it's not a dormitive virtue. So what exactly does he have in mind here? Now, elaborating a little bit, the idea of a dormitive virtue is neither mine nor Sober. It's actually pretty old. To the best of my knowledge, it goes back to the French playwright Moliere, who in his play, The Imaginary Invalid, mocks a bunch of scholastic physicians who try to explain why opium puts people to sleep by ascribing to opium a dormitive virtue, a virtus dormitiva. So the idea is that, and this again, this is a mockery. Moliere says, these fools think that opium puts people to sleep because it has a dormitive virtue. Now, what exactly creates the mockery, the travesty here? Now, clearly it cannot be falseness, because no one can deny that opium does put people to sleep. The point, it seems to me, that it's completely vacuous. In other words, I cannot explain why opium puts people to sleep by saying that opium has a dormitive virtue, because ascribing a dormitive virtue is just another fancier way of saying that something puts people to sleep. So Moliere's point, as I understand it, is that if you paraphrase, you can explicate, you can give some kind of analysis, but you're not providing any causal explanation. If you think you're doing so, you'll end up like these scholastic physicians. I think it's a good point. The problem is, once you see how it works, it's surprisingly broad. Let's give Moliere the point that you cannot explain sleep induction by ascribing a dormitive virtue, because ascribing a dormitive virtue is synonymous with having the power to put people to sleep. But then, when I say that a glass is fragile, am I not just saying that it has the power to break when struck? When I say that salt is soluble, I'm not just saying that salt has the power to dissolve in water. And you might say, well, of course, but these are not really, they're not scientific explanations. I agree. The problem is, once you see the point, it applies literally across the board. If fit on the propensity interpretation, fitness is a propensity to survive and reproduce. So how exactly does it work? How do I explain changes in the population of fruit flies in Sober's example by ascribing fitness to type A flies or greater fitness? Doesn't Moliere's point stick? In other words, it's not clear now what makes these dispositions any different from a normative virtue, which was mocked, rightly so, by Moliere back a few centuries ago. Now, what's the general puzzle here? Let me try to put all the pieces together. So I think I've made 4 claims, and I'm going to claim that if you put them together, these 4 claims generate an important tension. The first one is simply the fitness of disposition. And again, this goes back to Mills and Beatty, and again, if it's an illustration, I think once you bear with me here. But also as a disposition, it has an associated counterfactuals. So if you're starting to wonder, hey, wasn't this a workshop on counterfactual? Yes, but once you accept that there's an issue with dispositions, the same point applies mutatis mutandis to counterfactuals too. Now, dispositions, Moliere tells us, are explicative, but they're not explanatory. I think there's something to be said for that too. But then what we also have that fitness and dispositions like fitness are placeholders for a deeper explanation, and whatever holds for a disposition holds for the associated counterfactual too. Last but not least, we have Sober's point that placeholders are not just empty normative virtues, they are explanatory. And it seemed to me that all 4 points are perfectly sound. The problem is basically put them together and we have a flat contradiction, because now we have that dispositions like fitness and the associated counterfactuals are both explanatory and not explanatory. And again, that's not good news. We don't want the same thing to be both explanatory and not. So what's going on here? How do we get out of the conundrum? Now, attentive readers might note that, well, actually, let me go back here. You might note that getting rid of any statement between 1 and 4 will block the generation of the contradiction. So pick any premise, and if you're able to discard the premise in question, then we're good to go. I don't think if you don't find this intuitive, I can give you an argument for why I think each premise 1 through 4 is actually valid, and there's no way of getting rid of that. For the sake of time and to try to keep things short, I'm just going to tell you I don't think it can be done. But again, you don't have to take my word for it. Feel free to press me more. The only thing I'm going to stress once again that nothing here hinges on the choice of fitness as the disposition of choice. If you don't like that, we can pick your favorite disposition. The point is general. So I don't think we can get rid of any of these premises. And again, that's a huge placeholder for my argument, but I'm happy to unpack the black box if you're curious. So the only other option is to show that there actually is no contradiction. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to argue now for the remainder of my talk that the notion of placeholder turns out to be ambiguous. People, including myself, including my former self, we all talk about placeholders as a monolithic, univocal notion. I think actually there's at least 2 different kinds of placeholders. And again, the rest of my talk will try to make the point that drawing that distinction is crucial to see what goes on in these explanations. Here's the punchline, and then I'm going to give you some illustrations. One kind of placeholder is what I call, for a reason I'm not going to get into here, a frame. A frame is a placeholder that stands in for a sequence of behaviors, a series of events that are to be explained, but the frame in question does not explain them. A second kind of placeholder is what I call a difference maker, which is something that stands in for the causal mechanism that produces the behavior in question. And so basically and again, I'll give you an illustration in just a second, but with this point in mind, my point is simply that when we use a placeholder as a frame, it's a useful contribution to an explanation, but it's not explaining anything. Frames are not explanatory in the least. In contrast, difference makers, which stand in for causal mechanisms, are perfectly explanatory. And with this distinction in mind, I think we can get out of the conundrum, make sense of what Sober was saying about fruit flies, and at the same time maintain Moliere's intuition, which is what was driving my thesis about disposition and counterfactual being placeholders to begin with. So let me give you a simple illustration here. I have a very sweet 5-year-old niece, and I like to imagine her, coming to me while I'm cooking. Imagine I'm boiling a pot of water on my stovetop, and once the water boils, I toss in a handful of salt, and I'll give it a stir, and sure enough, the salt will disappear. And I imagine my niece coming to me and say, "Hey, what happened to the salt?" And I say, "Well, the salt dissolved. It is soluble." Question: What question is she asking, and what answer am I giving? And it seems to me, long story short, and what I'm going to do here is apply the distinction that I introduced in the previous slide. On the one hand, what she could be asking is, well, look, I know what salt is. I've tasted salt, I've played with, I've seen it, but I don't know what's going to happen when salt is placed in water. And when I tell her that salt is soluble, salt dissolved, I'm telling her that in water, salt dissolves as opposed to, for instance, exploding, as opposed to turning green, as opposed to sinking, as opposed to nothing, and so forth. So what I'm doing here, I'm providing very useful information, but I'm not explaining the behavior in question. I'm simply stating it. On the other hand, and note that this is captured by the same string of words, she could say, no, I know that salt dissolves. No, I've seen this. I know that it dissolves, doesn't explode, doesn't turn green, yada, 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 but I want to know why it dissolved. What is it about salt that salt dissolves, whereas, steel doesn't, wood doesn't, plastic doesn't? What are the causal mechanisms? A note here that the full explanation will be hard to give. If you ask me, I can probably, throw out a few truisms about chemical bonding and what happens, the chemical bonding of salt in waters, but very soon I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and say, go ask a chemist. And so what I'm doing here, I'm using the disposition as a difference maker, which provides a rudimental explanation, which is explanatory nonetheless. Now, I don't expect any of you to be shocked by this for the simple reason we're all familiar. That's the reason why I picked a 5-year-old in my example. But once you see the pattern in question, it applies to any kind of disposition, no matter how complex. It applies to the Sober's fruit flies. When I say that flies are fitter, I can use fitness, the associated disposition, the associated counterfactual to say what happens to the flies, or also to explain very simply why that thing happened. And that's a crucial distinction. And then to keep things short, I'm not going to delve into all these examples, but there's in genetics or molecular biology, similar things happen. This applies to once you see the point, I think it really applies across the board. So let me try to bring this to a close. I begun with my thesis that dispositions and the associated counterfactuals are placeholders for deeper explanations. Now, do these placeholders explain? Early on, I said, no, they don't. And now in hindsight, I said, no, that was a mistake, because I think Sober is correct, that counterfactuals, in some instances, and the associated disposition may explain. But I think he vice versa, was wrong in claiming that there's a clear asymmetry between fitness, for instance, and the dormancy virtue, because there's a sense in which none of these counterfactuals, none of these dispositions provide any explanation. And I think the way out of this conundrum is to note that there's an ambiguity here. As a frame, a counterfactual explains. As a difference maker, it does not. And once we amend the thesis like this, I think we can hold on to this idea that counterfactuals play the role of placeholders throughout scientific inquiry. Finally, let me just say a few words about who gives. Why is it important to draw this distinction between placeholders? And in an almost autobiographical note here, I'm in a Dickens spirit, I'm going to distinguish it between 3 Ghosts of Christmas. I have a Ghost of Christmas past. For a while, I defended this view of counterfactual dispositions being placeholders, and I think as I stated it back then, the thesis is not tenable. It's a mistake. And I think drawing the distinction between frames and difference makers helped me amend that thesis. There's a ghost of Christmas present because, as I said, I have now a whole project and trying to make sense of these black boxes, and the distinction between two kinds of placeholders is a crucial component of that. And last but not least, there's a ghost of Christmas future. And had I had more time, I would have told you maybe a little bit about how I can use this distinction to analyze an important scientific concept, the concept of a biomarker. But again, I'm much more interested in what you have to say about this and all the ways in which I got this wrong, as opposed to babbling on forever. So in that spirit, let me just thank you for the attention, and happy to open up the Q&A. Thank you.